Now, the second one, or in the second example, here, the argument is already stated into symbolic form. Kaya lang, we have four premises, and we will try to take a look whether yung nilagay na conclusion is actually valid for the argument. Okay? We have premises 1, 2, and 3, and 4. And we have T as our conclusion. Have Q, R, S, and T as our propositional statement. So, how do we determine whether this argument is actually valid or invalid? Now, notice na yung sa standard forms natin, tagdalawang premise lang yung ginamit, tapos naglagay ng conclusion na valid. Now here, we have four premises. What do we do to show na valid yung arguments natin? We simply divide, or kumbaga, we simply separate the premises, or himay-himayin natin siya in order for us to determine the validity of the argument. So first off, we can write the first two premise, 1 and 2. Q implies R and R implies S, and determine a valid conclusion for it, that is, by law of syllogism, Q implies S. Yan. Kumbaga, yung first two premises muna yung ginamit natin, and determine a valid conclusion for the two premises. So we have here, by law of syllogism, Q implies S. Now, next, we still have two remaining premises. Now, here, we will use, notice na parang may naiba. Yan. Now, yung third premise natin actually looks like this. That is, the negation of T implies the negation of S. Tapos, pagdating na dito, naging S implies T na siya. Now, here, by equivalent forms, yung conditional statement, yan, or by contrapositive, we will actually, or we can write the negation of T implies the negation of S into the form S implies T. Baga, tinanggal lang yung negation sa dalawang statement, tapos nag-interchange tayo ng positions ng mga proposition. Now, here, we will also determine a valid conclusion for combining the result or the conclusion of the first two premise with the third premise. Yan. So, kumbaga, ito kinumbine sa pangatlong premise. Yan. And observing the pattern, we will arrive with the law of syllogism, or using the law of syllogism, the conclusion will be Q implies T. Yan. Now, we already had presented the three premises. Now, we have the fourth premise, that is Q. And by the idea, or by the standard form for modus ponens, or the law of detachment, we can say na yung conclusion natin na T is actually a valid conclusion for the argument. Hence, T is a valid conclusion for the original argument with four premises. Now, we had already presented the standard forms of valid and invalid arguments, and also used the standard forms to determine whether an argument is actually or has a valid conclusion. Now, in this example, we will try to determine whether what conclusion will be valid for the presented argument. Now, here, our argument states that I will not go to Japan. Yan, that is represented by not J. Or we will go to Hong Kong, that is H. Now, if we visit my uncle, that is U. And then, we will go to Singapore, that is S. And our last premise, if we go to Hong Kong, then we will not go to Singapore. Now, first off, in order for us to determine a valid conclusion for this argument, we will have to translate it into symbolic form. Yan. Now, since given naman yung kung ano yung propositions natin, or how we will represent the propositions, we will simply translate them into symbolic forms. Now, our first premise is we will not go to Japan. That is not J, or, so we will use the disjunction here, we will go to Hong Kong. So therefore, our first premise in symbolic form is not J or H. Now, our second premise, If we visit my uncle, that is you, then. If, then. So that is a conditional statement. Now, we will have U implies S as our second premise. Now, the third premise will look like this. If we go to Hong Kong, then we will not go to Singapore. It is still a conditional statement. Hence, will be represented in this manner. P implies not S. Yan. So, we already have presented the three premises into their symbolic form. The next task is to actually determine kung ano yung magiging valid conclusion sa ating mga premises. Okay? Now, we can actually transform the first premise into its equivalent form. Now, recall the equivalent statements for conditionals. Yan. If we have here J implies H, yan, the conditional of that is actually, or yung equivalent form niya is actually not J implies H. Yan. Not J or H will have an equivalent form of J implies H. So, the same lang yan siya. Now, here we will have, or in here, we can rewrite the first premise na magiging conditional statement siya. Now, the third statement here, or our third premise here, is also transformed. That is actually, naging negation siya. Yan. Now, it is actually transformed into equivalent statement as a contrapositive of a conditional. Now, please do just an edit here. This is not J implies H. This is actually U implies S. Yan. This is actually an error. Sorry. Now, here, we can say na U implies S is equivalent to not S implies not U. Yan. By contrapositive of a conditional. Okay? Recall what are the equivalent forms for conditional statements. Yan. And then, our third premise here. Okay? Now, looking at our transformed symbolic form of our argument, now all of our premises have the same operations. It is all of them are conditional statements na. Hence, here, we can actually try to find a standard form na pwede natin na i-apply in order to find a valid conclusion. Now, here, we can recall na we can actually rearrange the statements kasi nga commutative yung mga premises natin. We can rearrange them. Yan. For example, we can interchange the second and the third premise in order for us to better determine the pattern or for us to better identify kung ano yung pattern na pwede natin makuha in order to arrive to a valid conclusion. Now, here, we have our first premise, J implies H. Our second premise, H implies not S. And our third premise, not S implies not U. Now, here we can now apply the law of syllogism or the extended law of syllogism. And hence, our valid conclusion will have to be J implies not U. Ayan, ito siya. Hence, this is just the symbolic form of our conclusion. And if we write it into an English sentence, our conclusion or our valid conclusion will be, if we go to Japan, that is statement J, then, now recall na we are using the conditional here. So, if we go to Japan, then we will not visit my uncle. That is the negation of statement U. Okay? Now, in identifying the valid or validity of what are or what can be valid conclusions in arguments, or determining whether a presented conclusion is actually a valid conclusion for the argument, you can use the truth table. Kaya lang, medyo mas nakakapagod siyang gawin, especially if you have many propositions na presented sa argument. Now, it will be faster and it will be easier if you can recall the standard forms for that. Now, here, Well, this argument may actually be proven as valid or invalid or determine this valid conclusion if you use the truth table. Kaya lang medyo mas mahihirapan tayo, mas marami tayong kailangan na papel, and mas kailangan natin na um, maging maingat. Kasi nga, when we do the truth tables, one error on one area can actually disrupt the whole table and you will have to do the whole table again. Okay? Now, this will be an easier method. Ayan. Okay? Now, if you have questions and queries or other concerns, or if you had found something na erroneous dun sa presentation, yan, you feel free, you can actually ask or feel free to comment down below and tell me what are your thoughts and ideas. Okay? Now, this has been Teacher Marie. Thanks for watching.